Hey, g'day, it's Pressy here. Thanks for joining me in the workshop today. Now this is episode 10 of the Mixie Clock build. Now Mixie Clock is a backlit digital clock with a steampunk inspired theme. And today we're going to be working on finishing some of the materials for the clock. Now by finishing I mean putting protective coatings on them. Now for this particular wooden frame I'm going to be using a hybrid French polishing process. And that means I'm going to put up to 20 coats of shellac on this bare timber. That's going to colour the wood. It's also going to fill the grain and it's going to bring up a slightly glossy finish on it. And then we're going to finish off with a single pack acrylic lacquer. Now that's not how traditional French polishing is done, but it gives you a very similar result with a lot less work. For the metal parts, I'm going to be powder coating some of the parts today. I'm going to be doing the end castings that go on the wooden frame. We're also going to do the base, and we're going to be doing the backs of the pressure gauges, which are actually thermometers. So let's head next door and let's get started on the wood. Now, just in case you haven't been following this series, I am making 2 of these clocks, and when you get to this point in the build, it's worth thinking ahead a bit, and not always something I do, but in this case I have. And what I've done is I've put a handle and a hook on each of these frames, and I'm going to be handling these parts a lot during the finishing process, and it takes time for the shellac to set in between coats, and it takes longer the more you put on. And especially when I get to the last step, which is spraying on the top coat, I want to be able to hang these up and avoid any issues with dust. Put it on a dusty bench and it wafts the dust up onto the part, you'll end up with a ruined finish. So I want to be able to hang these, and I want to be able to handle them without touching any of the surface. So that's what that's all about. Now the wood that we're dealing with today is New Guinea rosewood. It's a beautiful wood. It comes up with an orangey red colour, but the downside is that it has a very, very open grain. Now I probably can't show you this on the camera, but the pores in this wood are very open and they're very deep, and if we don't do anything about that, the finish will reflect all of those pores and all of that open grain. And sometimes you want that, sometimes that's a sort of a feature that you want in the timber. In this case I want the finish to be fairly glossy, so I'm going to fill the grain, and I'm going to use a technique which is fairly old for doing that, and I'll show you the materials we're going to be using for the first step in this hybrid French polish finish. Alright, this is the material that I'll be using for the first coats on that wooden frame. Now this is called shellac, and it's made from a secretion from the lac beetle. Now this beetle lives in Asia, particularly Thailand and India, and you can buy it either as a liquid form like this, or you can buy it as a dry flake. Now when you buy the flakes, they come in sort of crispy layers like that. This can be dissolved in denatured alcohol or methylated spirits, and it usually takes a day or 2 for it to dissolve, and it makes a very thin, runny sort of coating. Because it's based on alcohol, it means that the first couple of coats dry off very, very quickly, usually within minutes. And as the coating thickness builds up, it takes longer and longer to dry, but usually if you leave it overnight, the next day it's ready to sand back and continue adding coats to it. So over the course of 2 or 3 days, you can build up to 20 or 30 coats of shellac on your wood product, and because of the way we're going to apply it, it's almost impossible to get runs in it. So let's have a look at the materials that we're going to use to apply this to the wood. Now this is cotton waste. Now you can buy this from woodworking supply companies, but you also can sometimes get it from upholsterers who use it as padding underneath seat covers and so on. You also need some squares of cloth. Now this is cotton, but linen is better. The cotton is less hard wearing, but it's cheap, and as it wears out you just throw it away and apply a new square. So I've cut this up or torn it up into small squares. It's about 4 or 5 there, and I'll use it over the course of polishing that timber. So the way we do this is you just get one of these squares of cloth. This is actually a rectangular piece, but that's okay. And then put some of the cotton waste inside that square. Now you can use a little or a lot depending on the size of the project that you're working on. So let me bring that over there. And to make the thing which we call a rubber is quite easy. You just bundle that cotton waste up, pull a corner over the top of that, pull the next corner over, and just continue doing that, and you end up with a sort of a tail which you can twist. And you sort of make a little soft pad like that. And that is the surface that we're going to use to rub the shellac onto the wood. Now there are two ways to do this. You can dip this into a container of shellac, or you can open the back of the rubber and pour the shellac into the back of it. The advantage of doing it that way is that if you've got any impurities in the shellac, they get filtered by the cotton waste before it makes its way through to the front of the pad there. I won't be doing it that way. I'm just going to dip this into a container. I know that shellac is fairly clean, and for the size of the project I'm working on, it'll be fine. So there's our rubber. Like I say, these can wear out fairly quickly, so you just make a new one when you need to. Good idea also is to get a container with like an airtight lid, and when you finish for the day, put this inside the container, put the lid on, and it won't dry out overnight. Alright, this product here is called pumice, and you can buy this in different grades. This one here is triple F grade. This is not essential. If you've got a wooden project with fairly tight grain, you probably don't need to do this. But what the pumice does is it acts as a grain filler and also a mild abrasive. And when we sprinkle this on the wood and start rubbing the shellac over the surface there, the pumice will fill the grain, but it also will help to rub some of the fibres off the surface of the wood, and those worn off fibres also help to fill the grain. So we're just going to sprinkle it on and start rubbing the shellac in. I've cleaned this frame off and I've blown all of the dust out of the grain as much as I can anyway. And I'm going to just do this section here, which is bare wood at the moment. So we're just going to put a small amount of the shellac into this little bowl here. And it should be the colour of tea. And it should look clear, shouldn't have any floaty bits in it. So here is the rubber that I've already made up, and you just sort of tuck that loose piece of cloth into the palm of your hand. And this is the section we're going to be using here. Now, if I just rub the shellac straight onto the wood, you do it in a figure 8 pattern, working backwards and forwards. If you're going to use the pumice, you need to put just a thin layer of that on the wood. So what I've got is a little strainer. A muslin bag is even better. That's all I'm using. So just sprinkle a bit of that pumice onto the bare wood. That's plenty. And then dip the rubber into the shellac, or if you like, pour the shellac into the back of the rubber, and then start working this around in a tight circular pattern. So this is if you're using the pumice. And it'll feel gritty, and just keep charging the rubber each time you cover a new area. And what you should see is a mixture on the surface of that rubber, which is now pumice and wood fibre. Alright, so there's our first coating on the wood there. If you're doing this, you'll notice that you start to get like swirly patterns of what looks like a crust building up on the surface. And you can sometimes feel that. Now that's a mixture of the pumice and the wood fibre. The pumice will eventually break down into smaller and smaller particles and work its way into the grain of the wood. And that's enough pumice there now. I won't need to put any more on this section. Now if you're doing a big flat panel, you just do the whole surface in one go. This being circular, I've got to work my way around, doing about a quarter at a time. Now initially you've got to add quite a lot of shellac to the rubber, as you're soaking the cotton waste inside that pad, but also the wood itself is going to absorb a lot of the shellac. I'm hoping you can see this, but just there's a sort of a build-up of a sort of a pasty sort of material. Now like I say, that's the pumice and the wood fibre. Now don't worry about that, just keep going. That will eventually be sanded off the surface, and so the excess comes off. But your aim at the moment is to work all of that paste into the open grain of the wood. And once again, you can see that quite clearly there now. Okay, so you just keep doing this. You can work your way right around this cylindrical article if you like, or you can sort of just work on a patch, let it dry and sand it back. I will just keep going, work my way around. So that's the initial stage, and you just work that in, let it dry, and then it looks like this one. And it sort of feels a bit gritty and a bit rough. But what we're going to do now is sand this off and make it smooth, and then we'll put another layer of shellac over it. Once again, there's that sort of pasty, crusty material there, which is a mixture of pumice and wood fibre. But as you see in a minute, that's all going to sand off. So this is 320 grit sandpaper, and it's on a sort of a flexible rubber sanding pad. And what you don't want to do is sand right through. So even after just a small amount of sanding, that feels much smoother. There's an area just here which looks like a big white streak or a stain. That will come off. So let's just concentrate on that area. And you sort of hear when I go on to the new area, and then it sort of smooths out and becomes much more silky. Now there were actually 4 screw holes here, and you can actually see that they've filled up now with a mixture of pumice and wood fibre. So that's how good a job it does at actually filling up the grain. Now there are some areas where the grain is still open. You can see by those little white streaks there, that's dust that's got into the open pores of the wood, and I can either keep going with the pumice and the shellac or blow that out and just fill it up with shellac. It'll take a lot more coats, but you will eventually fill all of that grain. Now some of these other areas are done, alright, so that's showing no indication of open pores in that area at all. I will be using a sanding sealer on this before I put the top coat on, the last coat, which is a single pack acrylic lacquer. But you know, you can do a lot of the work initially just with the shellac and the pumice. There's a little build up just there which I need to get off. If you sort of inadvertently trap some of that pasty material underneath the shellac, it'll stay there. So you need to have a good look at it before you move on and start adding any more coats. The other thing you're going to get on your sanding paper is like little sticky bits of shellac. You get this if it's not cured properly, it'll build up on the paper and eventually you have to throw it away and get a new piece. But that's very hard to clean off, and if you don't clean it off, it can scratch the surface of your finish as you go. This is the one that I started yesterday, and you can see I'm just working my way around, continuously around the surface here, and you can do that, it dries that quickly. And what you're trying to do is to run the strokes right off the end of the part, and that way you won't get a build up at the ends. So run the rubber right off that end, Same there, start there, run it right off the end. Now in some areas like this hole here, you've got to be careful you don't sort of wipe it off and it'll dribble down the inside. Now as it turns out, I'm not bothered about that hole. Now I know you're worried about that hole, you want to know why it's there, it wasn't there last time I saw this video, what's it all about? Well, I'll give you a hint toward the end. I kept alluding to this secret feature on the clock, and now you're seeing evidence of what it's going to be like. Now these areas in here I am worried about. They're going to be visible in the finished clock, so I'm just going to run the rubber around the inside of that. This is more about getting a uniform colour. I'm not so much worried about getting a glossy finish on the inside here. Okay, I'm going to let that set and dry, but you can see the gloss starting to come up on that now. And you start to see the luster in the grain. It accentuates the ribbony sort of nature of this grain, and you see the different highlights on it when you expose it to the light. It's about 4 hours later, and this is already quite dry. And what I'll do now is sand this back using one of these ultra fine sanding sponges. And of course you should always sand with the grain when you're doing this, as much as you can. On these little short ends it's sometimes difficult, but you don't want to be sanding across the grain. You'll leave scratches and they will be visible later on when you put your very glossy top coat on. So this is going to need a little bit more work. I'll keep at this. I'm looking very carefully. There's a few little patches right near these ends where the pumice and the wood fibre was sort of built up, and I need to be sure that's off, or at least level, before we go any further. So that now feels really silky smooth, whereas before it was you could feel the wood fibre sticking up, or the pumice and the residue from the wood fibre, but that's all been cut off now, and this can have up to 10 to 12 more coats of that shellac very quickly. I can build those up over a period of an hour or so. Now I've moved on and done about say 20 coats of shellac around both of these clock frames, and you can see the level of gloss that I've got at this point. Now there's nothing to stop you from continuing with this process, and you will eventually build up an extremely glossy finish. But I'm not after a sort of a Steinway piano finish. I'm looking for something that has the colour of shellac, but it has more durability. So I'm going to briefly describe the rest of the process from this point onwards. So having let that shellac cure overnight, I've then sanded back the surface with a very fine sanding pad, checking it thoroughly, and then I've gone over that again with steel wool, just working down the length of the grain. After that point you need to make sure that you've got all the particles of dust and steel fibres off the surface before you move on. The finishing, the top coat, is done in 2 steps. The first step is a wattle style wood sanding sealer. Now this finish has to be sprayed on, you can't brush it on, you can't wipe it on. And the advantage of the sanding sealer is that it has a high amount of solids in the paint, so that when you're sanding it back there's less chance of clogging up the sandpaper, and it also means that it gives this beautiful softly textured finish when you're done. So again, it has to be cleaned, and then you move on to the top coat after that. Now the one that I'm using is a 95% gloss. I also have a 50% gloss if you're not after that really, really high luster finish on it. But I think for this job, the 95% is going to look good. So again, it needs to be sprayed on. You need to be very, very careful to make sure you don't get a build-up anywhere and get any runs in it. That can be rectified, but you really don't want it. Well, these pieces have had overnight now to harden up, and the feel of this style wood finish is beautiful. It's not sticky or tacky in any way at all. It's got this beautiful slick feeling to it. There's still a hint of the pore structure of the wood showing through here, which is actually a good thing. I want this to look like wood. I don't want it to look like some fake piece of plastic. The colour's beautiful, and it's just got that slightly off 100% gloss finish, which is what I was looking for again. So let's put them aside. Let's now start looking at the metal parts and getting those finished. These 4 castings here have all got defects in them, and these have been in the sandblaster just to roughen up the surface. And I'm going to fill the defects now using this stuff, JB Weld. Now I've never used this before. I believe a lot of people swear by it. They reckon you can fix anything with it. We'll soon find out. But the thing about this stuff is that it flows very easily, and you can get it into all these little nooks and crannies in the casting there, whereas the metal filled epoxies, the kneadable types, are very stiff and hard to work into those sort of small areas. So we'll give this a try. Specs on this show that it will withstand the 200 degrees centigrade that we're going to use for powder coating. And if it's a total fail, I'll just take it all off again. So on this one in particular, there's quite a bad defect there. So I'm just going to sort of paste that in there. And all around this edge, right around here. So I'll fill all that up as well. And this is sort of 24 hours to reach its full strength. But what I might do is bake this in the oven for a while, just to speed that process up. So I think like low temperature, 50 to 60 degrees C, it should set this off a lot quicker without making it liquid and making it run everywhere. Another bad one there. Alright, so I'm going to keep going with this, so I won't bore you to tears by doing all of it. When we come back, I'll have started the sanding process. We'll see how that turns out. But this is going to make it look semi-acceptable. Well, they're all done. I'm just going to wait for that to go off. But like I say, I think I'm going to bake this in the oven at about 50 degrees C. Just left that to cure overnight, and now just sanding off the excess. Unfortunately, there's no easy way to do it. And it comes off pretty easily actually. I'm using 100 grit woodworking sandpaper to get that off. This one's pretty much done. And that's ready to go back into the sandblaster now, just for one final run over with the grit, just to make this surface like a uniform texture. But I don't want to erode the epoxy because it will be slightly softer than the aluminium. But yeah, now when I get all these done, we'll get on to the powder coating, and we'll talk about the colours that I'm going to use. Just thought I'd show you these castings before I do the powder coating. Now this is one of the base castings that was pretty good and didn't need any filling. Same with this end cap. I just sandblasted that one all over. This one here though, this is the one that I filled, or one of the ones that I filled, and you can see after sanding that off and doing a final sandblast on that, it's pretty good. And I now have to consider what colour and what texture I'm going to put on these parts. Now when I originally designed this clock, I thought that these would be brass, and as it turned out they were big castings that would have required a lot of brass, and I decided to do them in the aluminium alloy. But I thought I could make them look like brass by using the appropriate powder coat colour. This one here is called polished aluminium, and this is a like a shiny metallic powder coat that you can put on any type of material to make it look like polished aluminium. And over the top of that you coat with a different powder coat called golden brass 2. At least this is one that I bought. Now this is a transparent top coat, and it's got that yellowy sort of colour, and it's supposed to make any part look like brass, but I think it's a bit pale and it's not really what I was looking for. Here's a machined aluminium part that's been done with the same two-step process, and it's all right, but I think it sort of comes out a bit wishy-washy and a bit sort of orangey colour, so I've decided not to go with that. Right, here are two other options that I considered. This one here is called Silver Artery. These are little test samples that I make up every time I get a new powder coat, and just keep them on hand so I can remind myself what they look like. Now these artery colours have got a texture. It's got like a speckled texture in it, not quite a wrinkle finish, but similar to that. And this has got a silvery grey charcoal sort of appearance to it. So that was an option, but the one that I've decided to use is this one here. Now this is called Black White Vein. Similar sort of texture to this one. And if you get them in the right light, you can sort of see that there's these little pits in the surface of it. But this one here has sort of got a more of a silvery colour with a sort of a slight grey tint to it. And I think that's going to work well with these two parts here. So that's what I've decided to use. Maybe the wrong decision, but that's where we're going. On these pressure gauges, I've decided to use this one here. This is a matte black. It's actually called Flatter Black. There it is there, Flatter Black. And that's very similar to the pressure gauges that I've got on my welding unit, oxyacetylene regulators, that sort of thing. It seems to use the same type of powder coat or paint. And I think that's going to work well with these. It's going to be a good contrast against the brass parts. So we'll do those. Now for this base here, I'm going to use a wrinkle black. Now I don't have a sample of that one unfortunately to show you, but you'll see it when it's done here. The wrinkle black looks like the sort of finish that was used on old scientific instruments, so things like old microscopes and laboratory equipment, and I think that's going to work well with this casting here. The other good thing is that it's heavily textured and it'll hide some of these little tiny pits in the casting surface there, so that's what we're using there. So I've got my powder coat unit set up. I'm not going to show you that process, we'll just sort of look at it as it's done. I've got earlier videos that show how to do powder coating in the home shop, and I'll put a link up above if you'd like to go back and look at how I do it at home here. And when we come back, I'll have all these parts sort of freshly powder coated and we can have a good look at them. Well, here are the two aluminium bases after putting that wrinkle black powder on, and they come up really nice. You can sort of see that wrinkly texture on there, and it does help to disguise any defects in the casting. And I know I said I wasn't going to show you how this process worked, but there was a problem. And the problem was that the JB weld, where I'd used it as a filler, absolutely rejected the powder. And as I was putting the powder on, you could see it building up around where the filler was, but it certainly wasn't sticking to the fill. And in the end, I blew all the powder off and I fixed it by using a process called hot flocking. I'm not joking, that's what it's called, hot flocking. And in this process, you put the part in the oven, complete with the filler, get it up to 200 degrees C, and then you put the powder on while the part is hot. And what happened then was that as the powder got attracted toward the metal around where the fill was, it sort of stuck to the fill as well, and that built up. And once you get a layer of powder over anything, that layer is what attracts the powder that goes on top. So I'm going to try to show you on this one. This has got the filler. I'll see if I can replicate that problem, and then we'll fix it by doing the hot flocking. I would normally do this powder coating in my other workshop, but I've got the sandblaster set up in there, so I'm having to do it out in this one in the machine shop, which is not ideal, but the dust is loose at the end of this process. You can just blow it off most of the surfaces. So let's try this. Now, probably not a good colour to show you. I think you can see there that the JB weld is still visible even though we've got powder on the rest of the part. heated up. Right, that's been back in the oven for about 15 minutes. And we've got to work quickly. That's much better. So now that we've got a layer of powder on top of that filler, the new powder is just attracted over the first layer of powder that went on there. And because that metal is hot, it sort of adheres a lot better as well. So we've got a good uniform coating there. I think that's good. So we'll put this one in the oven now. We'll bake it. So here's another one with the filler on it. Same deal, that's worked really well. The only problem with using silver powders on silver parts is you really can't tell how much you've got on there. Well, here are those end castings, and I've had a close look at them and I can't see any of the defects that I filled with the JB Weld. And there were plenty of them there beforehand, I can tell you. But that black-white vein texture is quite deep and really, really noticeable when you handle it. It's quite like an eggshell finish. Looks great. So let's have a look at the thermometers, or the fake pressure gauges. Well, here's one that's been assembled. I've still got to clean up this copper and brass and get all that looking nice. Here's one, and I popped the thermometer into that. But if you look at the back of that, you can see how beautifully uniform that coating is. And I think you'd have a hard time replicating that with paint. Or at least if you were able to get paint looking like that, it wouldn't stay looking like that. This stuff is very durable. It sticks like glue to the aluminium. And I love the matte finish on it. And yes, that is the temperature today. This is the beginning of our winter. So what is that? That's about 19 degrees centigrade. What's that in imperial? About 69 degrees Fahrenheit. Hey, not too bad. Well, sadly, I think we've run out of time for today's video, and in the next one we're going to start assembling all of these parts. Now, off camera, I'll get all the copper and brass parts cleaned, and they'll be ready for assembly. There's going to be lots and lots of wiring, lots of fiddly tiny parts to be fitted, and I'm going to reveal the true nature of this hole here and what it's meant to do on the clock. Now, for now, all I'm going to say is it has something to do with this and this. Now, if you know what that all means, certainly put it in the comments, but I sort of held that over till right to the end because I needed time to be sure it was going to work. I'll also be discussing a significant milestone in my YouTube channel. Now, according to YouTube, my subscribers are now up to 14,800. When that ticks over to 15,000, I figured I should do something special to thank everybody who stuck with me all this way. And I'll be announcing that in the next video. So for now, I'm going to say cheerio, and I'll hope to catch you on the next video. It's Prezzo signing out. Thanks for watching.